let me know, okay? Okay, so can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, super. So you've got to see if this will work. Right, so this is where we have got to. We were looking at this little one pulling themselves up to stand, talking about degrees of freedom in the hip joint, you know, how wobbly this joint is and how much learning there is for the brain to do to control that before they're able to stand on their own without support. Okay, so this is around 9 months. Remember, probably started self-locomoting around 8 months would be typical. And then by 10 months, so it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for the brain to work out how to control that hip joint, right? So by around 10 months, and these are average ages, so you know, baby may be a little bit ahead of this or a little bit later than this, we see them standing alone. All right? So I want to show you this piece of film because we can link it directly back to what we were doing on the center of gravity and base of support idea in chapter 3. All right? So if I click on now, do you see this video now?
Well, we do not.
You don't? Okay, hold on.
We still see the PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Kayla. I was hoping...
Yes, ma'am.
I was hoping it would just go to the video, but I guess it's not going to do that. It's going to let me share the video, so this doesn't help much at all, does it, really? I'm still messing around. Alright, so I need to be able to do... Now can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Hurrah! Okay. Let's play this again. So I would say this little one is not 10 months yet. There's not enough control of the hip to stand up without the help of something. Pretty close though, right? The other thing that we can use this, you see how now, because she, possibly a she, is holding on to the little walkie toy, then that increases her base of support and provides more balance, because now the walkie toy is part of the base of support as well, right? So that allows her to stay balanced. If that walkie toy was maybe shorter or not so solid that she couldn't lean on it that way, then maybe we wouldn't see the same behavior, okay? Come out here and come back. So, once they're standing without support, and those hips are getting stronger, their legs are getting stronger. Takes somewhere around 8 weeks before they can walk on their own. So they can walk at 10 months if you're holding on to them, or if they're holding on to something else, right? But walking alone takes a little bit longer because it takes so much more strength. Okay? 12 months is average. You will see children walk as early as 9.5, 10 months, and they'll walk as late as 15 months. Okay, so that range would be considered okay. If they're not walking by around 15 months, if it goes longer than that, then probably the pediatrician is going to want to do some testing, because that would indicate something unusual. Okay. So let's think again about our rate limiters. All right, remember that the rate limiter is the individual constraint, and when we're looking at this age group, it's the last constraint to develop that allows that movement to occur. Right? So these are really rapidly changing during this age group. Right? They're growing very quickly, they're putting weight on quickly. Right? So these rate limiters and their individual constraints are changing almost every day. All right? So what's interesting when we look at behaviors that are confined by individual constraints, you would think, okay, the child isn't walking because the legs aren't strong enough. Well, why aren't the legs strong enough? Okay, so cultural norms, which would be an environmental constraint, right? Social, cultural, physical constraints all fit under environmental, right? So we have some cultural perspectives that can sometimes hold back a child's development. Unintentionally, obviously, but when we're looking at it from a motor perspective, we see them a little bit delayed. So for example, in America and the US, we have what they call first child syndrome. And we often see first child syndrome. And that's when the caregiver, so that's, hopefully mum, but it might not be mum, spends a lot of time carrying the child, right? So they carry them everywhere, put them on their hip, they take them everywhere with them, right? Because it's the first one and it's adorable and it's precious and we don't have any experience yet, right? Don't know that I can put it down on the floor and it's going to be okay, okay? Because maybe the floor's dirty. What if it gets sick, right? All kinds of reasons why mum carries the baby around with her all the time. Okay? And what we sometimes see with that situation is that baby's crawling and creeping behavior is then delayed, right? And that knocks on a little bit to cognitive delay. It's not something they can't catch up once they are self-locomoting. It's just an interesting phenomenon, I think, because they haven't had enough opportunity to develop the strength to creep and then stand and then walk, right? So we tend to see, 3, 4, 5 weeks delay in these behaviors in children like that. Okay? Sometimes the previous motor milestone can act as the rate limiter for the child, right? So walking is very challenging to balance And so sometimes if their balance and their strength aren't developed enough, they'll drop back down to creeping and creep for another week or two and then have another go at walking. Okay? Cool, we just did that. Okay. So I mentioned a couple of times they use the reflexes in a pediatric clinic to test for typical development of the central nervous system. They're also going to look at these motor milestones and use those as well once the child has voluntary movement to look for delays that could indicate a problem that needs investigating. All right? So, for example, children with Down syndrome indicate hypotonia, so their muscle tone is very floppy, right? So that delays a lot of their milestones, right? It takes them much longer to stand up and walk than a typically developing child, all right? One of the things we want to be aware of always is that, I mentioned on Tuesday, babies are hugely inquisitive, right? So once they self-locomote, they're investigating all the time. They're looking at things, they're touching things, they're moving things, right? Their little brains are learning heaps and heaps and heaps of information every day. So if there's a delay in that self-locomotion, then it's probable that we see a delay in perceptual and cognitive development. So depth perception, for example, we'll talk about depth perception a lot more later on, but depth perception will be a little delayed, right? So, one of the terms you want to become familiar with is this idea of coupling. All right, and what that means is that from a neurological perspective, we're putting together two pieces of information. So I take the sensory information and I link it to the motor response. All right, that takes practice, it takes experience, okay? And if there's a delay in coupling the sensory information with the response, then that can be a functional rate limiter, right? It's an individual constraint. It's a lot more subtle than the idea of strength, right? Strength is a structural constraint. It's very easy to understand that if the child's legs aren't strong enough, they're not going to stand on their own yet, right, or walk. But this idea of coupling sensory information and then the motor signal from the brain is a little more subtle, and that would be a functional rate limiter. So there's quite a lot of really cool video and research looking at this idea of coupling this information. And they use what they call the moving room to look at some of this. So now I have to find that link because I forgot to put it in this PowerPoint. Hold on. Find this link for you because this is a cool bit of video. Okay. So the moving room works on the idea that we link our visual information and our kinesthetic information to postural control, okay? And humans are highly visually dominant. So even when we're getting kinesthetic information that conflicts with the visual information, our brain tends to go visual. So you've probably experienced this on a plane or a train or in a car if you're sitting in a traffic jam, right? You're sitting and the vehicle next to you moves and you feel like you moved. But all those joint receptors, muscle receptors, pressure receptors, vestibular receptors are telling you you didn't move, right? But because you caught the movement in your visual field, it feels like you started to move, right? So when they do the research, they're looking at this and they use a three-sided room that's on rollers. And so they move the walls and they challenge the individual's balance in different ways to see what will happen. Okay? So let me show you this little clip. Can you see this?
How important then is this visual information in maintaining balance?
Yes, we can.
Most
Okay.
adults, even when doing a difficult task, the sway is small and balance is easily maintained. But if visual information is important, then it should be possible to upset a subject's balance in an experimental room by moving the room gently forwards or backwards. Infants learning to stand are less stable than the adult and far more easily put off balance. The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month. When we move the room backwards, the child falls. And again. In 92 trials of this type, 7 infants, balance was clearly disturbed in the predicted direction in 82% of the trials.
So on that one, they moved the walls forward and she tipped forwards.
Visual information.
On that one, they moved it back.
Mechanical information.
So cute.
But the adult, however, is less sensitive to conflict between visual and mechanical information, and movements of the room do not, as with the infant, knock him over. But let us give him an unfamiliar balancing task, such as standing on a narrow beam. With his eyes closed, he depends solely on mechanical stimuli, quickly becomes unstable, and falls off. Or, with his eyes open, if the room is moved, even slightly, he will lose his balance, just as the infant did.
Right? So, so they look at this, what they call coupling, using that experiment. And it's quite interesting. They do it with infants, with adults, and with elderly adults. And it's the reaction, and we'll come back to this later in the semester, when you watch the adult sway, then we're looking at muscular contractions at the ankle, the knee, and the hip. And we see changes from the baby through to the adult in which muscles are contracted, right? Or the delay in the muscle being contracted. So part of the problem when they move the room towards her and she sat down on her bum is that she can't react quickly enough, right? And so she falls over. We see a similar situation in the elderly, right? Because we start to see a slowing down of this ability to couple because the nervous information is a little bit delayed, the decision making becomes delayed, right? And so we start to see much more sway in an elderly person because of the coupling is kind of uncoupling almost, right? So very cool. Questions?
No.
No? Okay. Well, let's pull up. Pull up number 5. You're not going to be able to see it unless I link. Can you see number 5? Probably not.
I don't think so.
No. Just seems like I have to share the new screen every time. I don't see the point in sharing the screen if maybe I need to be sharing. Oh, I don't know. This is too complicated for my brain. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we've got the infant to the point of standing and beginning to walk. All right, so now we want to look at the development of human locomotion. Okay. So, locomotion just means moving from point A to point B, all right? And as humans, we have various options for that, all right? When we start to self-locomote, that's probably going to be tummy crawling and creeping. It might be, for some children, walking on their hands. Like I said, if they've got a hard floor, some children will bum scoot. Occasionally you see like elephant walking. They'll walk on their hands and feet rather than creeping on their hands and knees, right? The majority of babies creep. So it's a small number of children that pick a different locomotion form at that age, right? But walking, running, all our fundamental gross motor skills that are on our MSU chart and on our TGMD charts, right? Hopping, skipping, galloping. Swimming is locomoting, right? Because I move from point A to point B using gross, large muscles, okay? So what we're interested in, again, because we're looking across the lifespan, what choice of locomotion do we use at what point in our life, right? So that can change across time because of motivation or because of injury, right? Or because of anxiety, right? Perceived social acceptance can change your behavior. So One of my favorite skills is skipping, but if you were in Walmart and you saw me skipping down the aisles as an almost 60-year-old woman, you'd probably kind of raise your eyebrows a little bit and think I was slightly touched in the head. You could be correct about that, but, you know, right? So, locomotion, this idea, this definition of what locomotion is very simple, but it's actually an extremely complex movement activity, all right? So we want to, all the time, keep in mind our triangle of constraints theory and our interaction, right? Because the more we can identify which interactions are occurring, the more help we can be to someone to improve the motor pattern that emerges, right? So a little bit of overlap with chapter 4, right? The first thing we're going to see is commando crawl. So remember that around 2 months, they're able to lift their head up if they're lying on their tummies. By around 3 months, they can lift their shoulders up a little bit. You know, we give them a couple of more months. They start commando crawling, so they'll move their arms and drag their body along the floor. You see that quite often, right? And then we get to the point where they need to transition to typically creeping. Now, if you remember, on Tuesday, I said that we see this, let me see if I can just coordinate this from here so I don't have to keep looking backwards and forwards. That we see this, initially, they get up on their hands and knees and they start rocking while their brain is trying to work out how do I move a hand without face planting, right? So this, and then I have to go back here, then we have to stop sharing that and share this. All right, get in there. Let's make this bigger for you. Okay, so this is classic, right? We're doing our shoulder training exercises here. Getting our shoulders nice and strong. Our brain's trying to work out how do I move just one limb. Okay? This one I think. Okay? So now what's interesting, and try not to get confused because we use the same term again, we're going to, instead of couple sensory and motor information, now what the brain has to do is uncouple limbs, right? So when you first see the baby start moving its arms for itself, it moves both arms together, right? It will kick both legs together once it's voluntary, not necessarily when we're looking at reflexes or stereotypies, okay? But once it's voluntary, it's easier for the brain for both sides of the brain to send the same information, right? So this is much easier than this, okay? And so to transition from this rocking to creeping, the brain has to, first the shoulders have to get strong enough to support. And then the brain has to work out, how do I move just one hand and then just one leg? Right? So that's a huge step to take for the brain to work out how it can control one piece of the pie, right? Stop that one, start this one. Okay, let's see. All right, so, we go over, and up we get. Hold on, aha, off we go, right? One. So he's strong enough to roll over, up on his hands and knees, and off he goes. Okay? Remember, all these film clips are up on your textbook website, so you can go back and watch them again. I encourage you to watch them lots of times. All right, so typically then we see creeping, we might see butt scooting, we might see bear walking, but not very often. Then we get to walking. So walking's an important development because A, it changes our perspective of our environment, right? Instead of looking at everybody's kneecaps, now I can stand up and look over the table, okay? It's our first bipedal locomotion, so it's the first time we see alternate leg and feet action, all right? So walking is mechanically defined as a 50% phasing between the legs. So what that means is that each leg does half the job of walking, okay? There has to be a period of double support. So if it's a walk, there's always a point in time where I have 2 feet on the floor, then I go single, then I go 2, then I go single, then I go 2. Okay? So, what's interesting about the change from standing to walking is I have to be able now to shift my balance within my base of support so I don't fall over, right? Because I can't stand and pick one foot up if I don't shift my center of gravity, right? You can't. Try it, right? If you're standing balanced on both feet and you just pick one foot up, you're going to fall over, right? In order to stand on one leg, I have to move my center of gravity over to that side. So the brain has to learn to do that. This leg now has to take all my weight. So I have to be much stronger to stand on one leg than I do to stand on 2 legs. Right? So again, there's a lot of development occurring that allows us to see walking behavior. Right? Also means that although the underlying timing generally is the same, we have this 50% phasing, changing in constraints, particularly structural constraints, can change the pattern, making it faster or longer, right? If I've got longer legs, I can take longer steps, right? But it's still going to be this 50% double support, single support, double support, single support timing idea. And when we do perception, we'll come back to this idea, but the affordances that you learn for crawling, so I can do this in this environment if I'm crawling or creeping, right? When I stand up, I have to relearn those. So as I said, we'll talk about it more, but they do research looking at what happens if you put the child on a slope, right? So I learned to go down the slope on my hands and knees, but then once I started standing up and you put me back at the top of the slope, now I can't walk down there. I have to learn that again. And there's a lot of perceptual issues that are going on there that we'll cover later on. So think about your MSU chart for running. Walking and running look quite similar as they're developing, right? So when I'm early walking, the brain's #1 priority is to keep me safe, which means I need to be stable, all right? So we know from chapter 3 that to increase balance and stability, I need a larger base of support, right? So what we see is feet go out nice and wide, right? We have our arms up here, and that helps us. We often will see the feet turned out because that increases the base of support, and we take a step, and then we take another step, right? And then we take another step, and then we probably plop down onto our bum, right? So it's all about staying balanced. It's very up and down. It doesn't move forwards very much, right? Because I don't want to have to stand on that one leg for too long, right? And it's all about developing strength for that single leg balance. Right? So you've got to be able to shift your weight. You've got to have enough strength in your trunk and your hips and your legs. And you've got to develop a critical level of strength to support yourself on one leg. And then we see walking, right? You can watch that one. She's very cute. She has the loveliest smile. This is just a reminder from chapter 3. You know, if you're going to look at skills and analyze skills, you need to know what the course of the development for that skill is, and you need to watch from several different angles, usually at right angles to the plane of motion, right? So I can't coach a movement skill or teach a movement skill if I'm sitting on my bum in the gym, right? Because I can't see everything that is going on in that skill if I'm sitting in the same place. I have to be moving around so that I can see different planes of motion. All right? So #1 red flag, if you walk into a gym or you walk out onto a training field and the coach is stationary, they're not very good. Right? About that. Okay, so after a little while, the brain's like, okay, I'm getting the hang of this, but I want to get over there quicker, right? So we have to have this stability-mobility trade-off. I can't be stable and mobile, right? So gradually, as I get more confident and as I get stronger, right, I'm going to start taking longer steps. My hands drop down a little bit, and I'll take slightly longer steps. That means I have to stand on one leg for longer. Makes me less stable, right? 1 foot is less stable than 2 feet. So if I'm going to take a longer step, I have to stand on one leg for a longer amount of time, right? We start to rotate the pelvis a little bit as we move through this process. So if I'm going to take a really long step, I have to be able to rotate my pelvis a little bit. I can't keep my pelvis absolutely level all the time. Right? And we start to see the base of support decrease laterally as well. So what I mean by that is that initially we have our feet out here, and gradually our feet will come underneath our hips, right? So we decrease the base of support this way, but also laterally. And eventually, we're going to see some opposition, all right? So my hands are going to drop, 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 and then because of Newton's law number 3, action, reaction, I start swinging my arms. Right? Ah! Going the wrong way here. So this little one has been walking for some time. Right, you can see her feet are underneath her hips. Feeling a little silly, she's chewing on her fingers, not swinging her arms. But that's a pretty strong walking pattern there. So she's been walking for some time. Right? So by about 4, so if you were here, this is one of the frustrations I'm having. If you were here, we have a 2-year-old room, a 3-year-old room, and a 4-year-old room. So all those children are walking independently, but you would be able to see for yourself the changes in the walking pattern between the 2-year-olds and the 4-, 5-year-olds. Right? We've got a couple who are already 5 in the older room. And it's very dramatic, the change that occurs in what is a relatively short period of time. Right? So by about 4, you're seeing really all the characteristics of an older person walking. Right? The amount of time they can spend on one leg and the length of the steps they can get gets longer. How quickly they can walk is much better. They're able to produce more force, right? So if I'm going to walk faster, then I have to be able to push harder into the floor, right? Remember, to walk forwards, I have to push down and back. So if I'm going to walk forwards faster, I have to push down and back harder, right? So my brain is learning to turn on more muscle fibers and create more force production. Right? By mid-adolescence, then we've got much longer stride length, right? Their legs are growing. We see quite a dramatic difference during puberty, and the improvements in the walking pattern become a lot more subtle. You probably would need video equipment and force platform type stuff to really pick it up, right? Now, what's interesting, right, is that when we look at the other end of the span, so unless you get injured or something happens to you structurally, right, your walking pattern isn't likely to change from mid-late teens until way, way down the road, right? But as we get older, if we don't maintain our physical activity levels and we lose a lot of strength, then we see some pretty big differences in walking pattern, right? So the brain's job again becomes, I have to keep this person safe. That means I have to keep them stable, right? So the older I get and the weaker I get, the bigger the change in the walking pattern. So we're going to maximize stability. That means we start to see maybe some feet turned out type behavior. We will shorten the stride length so we don't have to stand on one foot for so long, right? We'll also start to keep our hips very square again, right? Again, so I'm not on one foot for very long. We slow down, partly because we've lost strength and therefore we've lost force production, but partly because the slower I am, the more stable I am, right? And if necessary, we'll end up needing to use external objects to help us balance, because think about what changes. As soon as I touch something, I've increased my base of support, right? So whether that's a handrail on the stairs, whether it's the back of the chair as you walk through the room, whether it's a walking stick or a walker, a frame, right? All those things increase my base of support and make it much less likely that I can fall over, right? Because my center of gravity has to move outside that base of support. The bigger the base of the support, the less chance there is of me tipping. Okay? Now, I watch my dad walk, right? And I've told my dad trains basically 7 days of the week. And he had back surgery about 9 years ago, which gives him a lot of pain. So he doesn't walk much anymore, even though he goes to the gym and trains and does all this other stuff. Walking is something that gives him problems. Riding a bike doesn't give him problems. It's very odd how injuries and pain develop. But even with all that, when he does walk, like down the garden path, his walking is pretty confident, right? It's pretty confident. It's still quite quick. Because I think he's so strong for his age, right? Because he lifts every day. So it's really interesting. If I watched my mum before she passed away, she could barely walk at all without a frame or a cane. She was very unstable. I mean, we were always having to catch her and stop her from falling over. Trying to teach her how to sit down and stand up out of a chair was like frustrating as all get out, because she wouldn't move her feet into a safe place for her to stand up, and so she'd have her feet too far under the chair. She'd stand up and tip forwards, right? So we were forever trying to get her to move her feet forwards and push on her arms, so that as she stood up, her center of gravity was over her base of support and she didn't fall, right? Because she didn't move. very sedentary, very sedentary. All right. Now, she also had a lot of health issues, some of which were her own fault and some of which were not her own fault. And so that made moving quite difficult for her, and as it got more difficult, she just did it less and less instead of challenging herself. Right? It's a totally different personality. And my dad's option is go challenge myself and keep myself strong, and my mum's option was I'm going to sit down and read another book. Right? It's not a right or a wrong, but her choices put her at more risk of falling. Okay? So again, the rate controller is an individual structural constraint. So as those change as we get older, then many of those changes become rate limiters for certain movements. So if I get arthritis in my hip, right, and so my range of motion decreases in my hip, then automatically my stride length gets shorter. And it is obvious that structural constraints are going to influence walking, but don't underestimate the strength of functional constraints. If I become nervous, if I become scared, we see a different walking pattern. Okay? All right. So, next Tuesday, we're going to start looking at running. Running is the next step after walking. Takes about 6 to 7, 8 months, depending on the child and the experience and the space they have to walk and learn to run. So we've got to get a good few months of walking under our belts to get strong enough to be able to run. Because running means I have a period of time where nothing is touching the floor. And that means I have to be strong enough to get myself up off the floor against gravity. So there's quite a big change needed in structural strength. Strength in the bones, strength in the muscles. Okay? So that's where we're going to start on Tuesday. Questions?
Will there be any, what's it called? I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. For the e-portfolio for lab,
Sure.
are you going to be going over that, I guess you could say like rubric or list anytime soon, or will that be something like we do on our own?
I did go over it a little bit last week, but I've changed it again slightly. No, I can make time for that. Maybe Monday we're going to go and film for you, so maybe Wednesday. Or you can come and talk to me during office hours.
Okay, that sounds good.
But I can try to remember to build it in next Wednesday as a little piece just to go over that. Just remind me because I don't have it on the syllabus to do that.
Okay.
Okay?
We can do that.
A couple of the items in the guidelines are open for you to start playing around with so that you don't leave it all until the last minute. So things that we've covered are open. And we filmed a few TGMD locomotor skills yesterday. So I've put those video clips up. If you have not used MediaSite before, when you click on the video, it might make you log into MediaSite. That's just your normal ENMU username and password. You don't have to create a new one for that. And then tomorrow we're going to go and video some ball skills, probably kicking and throwing, maybe catching. Haven't decided yet. We'll see. So yeah. And then the actual, I'm working on the rubric for analysing the film. So I did change what we were going to do out on the playground, so that you guys only have to do 1 day a week. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okie dokie. All right. Well, have a good weekend. Keep an eye out on Blackboard tomorrow for the object control skills. Wait till you see the film. They're so cute. They're so cute. And yeah, have a great weekend. It's going to be lovely and hot. Might be the last hot
Yes,
weekend.
ma'am.
Okay.
Sounds good.